Imagine the most powerful man in the world weeping in a filthy basement, crying over stolen costumes while an empire celebrates his death. That's how the dark history of Rome remembers Nero, the worst Roman emperor. And tonight, we're tearing open the secrets behind Nero's last days. You find yourself standing in the shadows of a crumbling villa outside Rome, the dawn light of June 9th, 68. AD barely penetrating a choking mist thick with the stench of fear, betrayal, and imperial madness. Somewhere beyond the half-rotted wooden door, the voice of Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, an emperor who once commanded legions, burned cities for entertainment, murdered his own mother, and composed poetry as flames devoured his capital cracks and trembles as he mutters the same phrase again and again, qualis artifex pareo. What an artist dies in me. This is the man who ordered a mother's execution, kicked his pregnant wife to death, forced a teenage boy to become his bride, and possibly set the eternal city ablaze, sparking questions still whispered by historians. Did Nero burn Rome now? The monster stands on the brink of ruin, not surrounded by marble columns or loyal guards, but cowering like a hunted animal in a freedman's hovel, his gilded illusions shattered, his empire crumbling beneath the weight of his own cruelty. But to understand how the emperor who believed himself a divine artist ended up weeping in terror, we must dive into a saga of poisoned mushrooms, collapsing death boats, burning Christians, forbidden marriages, and a Rome drowning in blood and music, a story so twisted, it makes the line between artist and monster vanish. Before we reveal how Nero's final hours became one of history's most pathetic finales and how his twisted obsessions turned the empire into his stage, don't forget to hit like, subscribe for more tales from the dark history of Rome. And tell me in the comments, was Nero truly insane or just the inevitable product of absolute power? Because as we peel back the shadows of his last days, one truth burns brighter than any Roman fire sometimes. The worst monsters wear the crown and call themselves artists. On December 15th, 37 AD, as the first pale light of dawn spilled across the waves crashing onto the shores of Antium, a cry pierced the salt-laced air, a cry that history would remember as the birth of one of Rome's darkest emperors. A child who would one day haunt the empire's nightmares and leave his name scorched into the annals of infamy, Nero, whose real name at birth was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. Even in that moment, the omens whispered of fire, cruelty, and blood. Because this was no ordinary infant, he arrived into a family tree dripping with violence and ambition, a dynasty whose branches wrapped around the throat of Rome itself. His great-great-grandfather had ridden an elephant through the provinces of Gaul, parading the severed heads of his enemies like grim trophies, proof that the family name was built upon conquest and terror. His grandfather once gouged out a Roman knight's eye in the middle of the forum for daring to oppose him, turning civic debate into a theater of blood. And his father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, a man whose name meant red beard but whose spirit burned black with cruelty, was so notoriously vicious that when friends congratulated him on the birth of his son, he spat back with ice-cold honesty. Nothing that was not abominable and a public bane could be born of Agrippina and myself. That single sentence, dripping with venom and fatalism, now echoes across the centuries as perhaps the most prophetic line ever uttered in the dark history of Rome. A chilling forewarning that the worst Roman emperor was already taking his first breaths. For little Lucius, there would be no gentle childhood of laughter and sun-dappled gardens. Instead, his earliest years were a brutal lesson in how quickly the wheel of fortune could turn. When he was only 3 years old, his father died. Some whispered it was poison. Others claimed dropsy finally claimed the brute, but either way, the child inherited barely a third of the family fortune, a pittance that was quickly swallowed whole when Emperor Caligula, Agrippina's own brother, seized every last coin and property for the imperial coffers. And so began one of the darkest chapters in Nero's childhood, a chapter every historian still revisits when unraveling how monsters are made. Agrippina, once the dazzling sister of the emperor, found herself exiled to a barren island, stripped of power, her son left behind with nothing but the meager care of his Aunt Lepida, two loyal slaves, a dancer and a barber, hardly the tutors fit for a boy destined to rule the world. Yet lurking behind Agrippina's disgrace was a rage and ambition so relentless it would shape the empire's fate. Because Agrippina wasn't merely a woman scorned, she was the great-granddaughter of Augustus himself, a creature woven of imperial blood and sharpened ambition, a woman who'd already buried one husband under suspicious circumstances and would do far worse to place her son upon Rome's throne. And though Lucius was still just a boy with frightened eyes and thin, patrician features, history was already chiseling him into the mold of a tyrant. For Rome was a city where bloodlines were currency, where conspiracies thrived like weeds between marble columns, and where a mother's love could turn sharper than any dagger. As we stand on the cusp of his next chapter, the question burns like oil on flame. How did this fragile boy, born amid stolen fortunes and poisoned dinners, transform into the tyrant who would murder his mother, ignite Rome, and force a teenage boy to become his empress? Stay with me, because the shadows are deepening, and the next twist in Nero's dark legend is where power, lust, and blood collide in a way that still leaves historians asking, was Nero truly mad, or merely the empire's inevitable creation? 4 years after Caligula's reign ended in a pool of blood and betrayal, Rome found itself under the rule of an unexpected emperor, a stammering, drooling scholar named Claudius, who, to the shock of the Senate and the Praetorian Guard alike, stumbled his way onto the throne in 41 AD, proving that in the dark history of Rome, power often landed in the hands least fit to wield it. Yet lurking in the shadows of marble columns and velvet-draped corridors was a woman who refused to fade into obscurity. Agrippina the Younger, sister to the slain Caligula, great-granddaughter of Augustus himself, a woman forged in the flames of imperial ambition and sharpened by exile, whose very name would one day be synonymous with the phrase, power behind the throne. Her comeback was nothing less than a masterclass in lethal Roman politics, a story that still leaves historians gasping at the scale of her cold, calculated vengeance. Having clawed her way back to Rome, Agrippina wasted no time, setting her sights on survival first and supremacy second. She secured a marriage to Gaius Passienus Crispus, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, a man whose staggering fortune seemed to shield him from imperial turbulence until he conveniently died soon after their wedding, leaving Agrippina with a river of gold to fuel her next play for power. And that next play was audacious, even by the standards of deadly Roman marriages. For standing in her way was Claudius's current wife, Messalina, a woman whose name still drips with scandal, famed for sexual appetites so legendary that even the decadence of Rome seemed too small a stage for her. Messalina's fatal mistake wasn't merely bedding countless lovers, but daring to stage a mock wedding to her paramour Gaius Silius, while Claudius still sat on the throne. Whether it was drunken folly or a genuine coup, it was the opportunity Agrippina needed to strike, because in Rome's Game of Thrones, the greatest weapon was scandal. Messalina's head rolled, and Agrippina stepped into the vacuum with all the silent elegance of a panther. Picture it, Claudius, the emperor who could barely speak without tripping over his own tongue, utterly enthralled by his niece's beauty and cunning, though Roman law screamed in protest that uncle and niece were forbidden from marrying. But laws, as Agrippina well knew, were merely suggestions to those who wore the purple. In 49 AD, 12-year-old Lucius, soon to be known to the world as Nero, watched as his mother became Empress of Rome, draped in imperial finery, a living testament to how the empire's bloodline twisted upon itself in pursuit of absolute power. Agrippina's ambitions soared higher than the golden eagles adorning Rome's standards. For she understood one unshakable truth about this dark empire: power was never given. It was seized. And she wasted no time bending Claudius to her will, pushing him to adopt her son, to elevate young Lucius above his own biological heir, Britannicus, and to cement the boy's path to the throne by marrying him to Octavia, Claudius's own daughter. It was a move that turned the imperial palace into a simmering cauldron of hidden knives and poisoned cups, where family ties doubled as potential nooses. And though Agrippina stood resplendent as empress, the whispering corridors of Rome already buzzed with fear, because everyone knew that when a woman like Agrippina tasted power, someone was bound to die. But the empire hadn't yet seen how far she would go to secure her son's crown, or how her lethal dance with destiny would shape the monster Nero was destined to become. And as we step deeper into this dark history of Rome, one question looms ever larger in a world where ambition bled into murder and love twisted into a weapon. Could even the iron will of Agrippina control the storm she was about to unleash in her own flesh and blood? And so, with Messalina's head on the executioner's block, and Agrippina seated beside Claudius as empress, Rome found itself holding its breath. For the dark history of Rome teaches that every ascent to power demands a price paid in blood. Agrippina wasted no time solidifying her plans for absolute control, bending Claudius to her iron will and ensuring that the empire's future lay not with his biological son Britannicus, but with her own son Lucius, who would soon be known to history and to our nightmares as Nero, one of the worst Roman emperors whose shadow would stretch across the centuries. The chess moves were relentless and precise, each piece falling into place like a dagger slipping between ribs. Claudius was persuaded to adopt Lucius formally, an act that transformed the boy into Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, a name now dripping with imperial weight. At just 13, Nero received the toga virilis, symbolizing his transition to manhood, while the Senate and Rome's elite whispered among themselves, calculating how long Claudius would remain alive with Agrippina lurking so close. By 14, Nero had been proclaimed heir, overtaking Britannicus, whose very existence now hung like a guillotine blade over Nero's young neck. And at 15, Nero was forced into a marriage that was as politically strategic as it was personally hollow, taking Octavia Claudius's own daughter as his wife, binding the Julio-Claudian bloodline into a tighter, more dangerous knot. But Agrippina, ever the dark Roman empress, was growing impatient, and Rome had begun to sense that Claudius was living on borrowed time. In October of 54 AD, the emperor sat down to dinner, unaware it would be his last meal. Officially, the cause of death was a stomach ailment brought on by mushrooms, a delicacy he adored, but the true story burned like poison in the whispers of Rome's corridors. Agrippina had finally decided that waiting was no longer an option. Some sources claim the first dose failed, prompting the infamous professional poisoner Locusta to finish the job with a feather soaked in lethal toxin, jammed down the emperor's throat under the guise of helping him vomit. Claudius died in agony, convulsing as poison gnawed at his guts, a grotesque end for a man whose reign had begun almost by accident. And in the death's cold wake, the empire found itself staring at an emperor barely 17 years old, a boy crowned master of the known world overnight, his face smooth with youth but his eyes already glinting with shadows. At first, Rome dared to hope that this young Nero might become the savior they longed for. His early acts appeared merciful, almost angelic, as though the darkness of his bloodline might be suppressed. When presented with a death warrant, the young emperor reportedly sighed. "How I wish I had never learned to write," sparking rumors that Nero might rule with a softer hand. He reduced taxes, showered gifts upon the people, and publicly vowed to govern in the wise, restrained style of Augustus, while those closest to the throne, the Senate, the soldiers, The people clung desperately to the fantasy that the boy emperor could erase the sins of his ancestors. But behind palace walls, Rome's old guard watched with growing dread, because they knew that history in the empire rarely traveled toward mercy. Seneca, Nero's philosopher tutor, reportedly dreamed he was teaching Caligula all over again, a prophecy that would prove chillingly accurate. For while Nero offered mercy in public, in the dark recesses of his mind, he was already planning his first murder, his paranoia coiling tighter with each passing day like a serpent preparing to strike. And as Rome exhaled, lulled by this fragile hope of peace, it remained blind to the reality that the monster was already learning the taste of blood. For waiting in the shadows was Britannicus, the legitimate son of Claudius, and in Nero's mind, the mere existence of that boy was an unforgivable threat. And so the stage was set for Nero's true nature to break through the thin mask of civility, a revelation that would stain the marble floors of the imperial palace with the first blood of his reign. Because in Nero's Rome, survival was never about justice. It was about eliminating anyone who might stand in the way of ultimate power. And next, you'll witness how one quiet dinner party turned into a deadly performance that sealed the fate of a young prince and announced to the world that the worst Roman emperor had truly arrived. Rome's breathless hope that young Nero might rule as a merciful prince evaporated like poison smoke in the winter air when, barely a year into his reign, the teenage emperor committed an act so cold-blooded that it would forever mark him as one of the worst Roman emperors. A crime that still sends shivers through the dark history of Rome, the calculated murder of his own stepbrother, Britannicus, a boy whose only crime was being born with a stronger claim to the throne. In a city where loyalty shifted like sand and betrayal hid behind every marble pillar, Nero's paranoia grew sharper with each sunrise. For he knew that Britannicus, though quiet and unassuming, carried the blood of Claudius and Augustus in his veins, a living symbol that threatened Nero's fragile grip on imperial power. So Nero, the emperor who had publicly sighed about wishing never to write death warrants, began plotting his first kill not on the battlefield, but at a dinner table draped in purple silk and soaked in shadows. The deadly theater unfolded one fateful night in the imperial palace, where Rome's most elite gathered under flickering lamplight, unaware they were about to witness a performance more chilling than any tragedy staged in the grand theaters of the empire. As goblets clinked and silver platters glimmered with roasted meats, Britannicus, just 14 years old, reached for his cup of wine and casually asked for it to be cooled, a harmless request in any household except one ruled by Nero. For waiting in the wings of this deadly scene was Locusta, Rome's infamous professional poisoner, a woman whose very name would become synonymous with whispers of death. Acting on Nero's orders, Locusta prepared a draught laced with a toxin so swift it would claim its victim before suspicion could take root. The poison was mixed not into Britannicus's wine, but into the simple water meant to temper its heat, a subtle touch that ensured only one cup at the table carried a mortal sentence. And so, in the hush between laughter and conversation, Britannicus lifted the goblet to his lips, oblivious that history was about to write him out of existence. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. As guests looked on, the young prince convulsed, his face contorting in agony, his skin draining of color as his eyes rolled back into his skull. Foam burst from his lips, his body seized with violent spasms, and he collapsed, the delicate threads of life shredding apart before Rome's most powerful witnesses. The imperial dining hall, once alive with music and chatter, fell into stunned silence as the aroma of roasted meat mixed with the sharp metallic scent of death. Yet amid the chaos, Nero, the boy emperor with the artist's soul and the predator's heart, continued eating calmly, pretending nothing unusual had occurred. When shocked voices whispered that Britannicus might be dying, Nero merely waved a dismissive hand and muttered that his stepbrother was known to suffer epileptic fits, a lie that echoed off the marble walls like a dagger striking stone. Even as Britannicus's body was carried away, still twitching with residual spasms, Nero ordered the dinner to continue, as though nothing more significant than spilled wine had occurred. And so, with that single ruthless act, the young emperor crossed an invisible line, soaking his reign in blood and proving that mercy had been nothing more than a mask. Rome would never look at him the same way again, and the whispers of worst Roman emperor began circling like vultures over a battlefield. Yet this was only the first taste, the first sip from a cup of cruelty that would soon overflow. For Nero was discovering that power tasted sweeter when mixed with fear and blood. And if Nero could murder his brother at a dinner table without blinking, what hope remained for anyone who dared to challenge him, including the very woman who had placed the imperial crown upon his head? For waiting just beyond this act of fratricide was an even darker chapter, where a mother's love turned deadly, and the empire would witness a son conspiring against the woman who made him emperor. For a brief, deceptive moment, Rome dared to hope that Britannicus's sudden demise would satisfy Nero's thirst for control. But in the dark history of Rome, power never stands still. And Nero's next target was the very woman who had placed the imperial diadem upon his brow, his own mother, Agrippina the Younger, a woman whose iron will and lethal cunning had once cowed emperors into silence. Their relationship, always a precarious dance of ambition and manipulation, now teetered on the knife's edge. For as Nero's confidence swelled with each brutal act, Agrippina's influence began to chafe like chains around his neck. Once, she'd been the power behind the throne, Rome's dark Roman empress whose whisper could dictate life or death. But now Nero wanted to taste the empire's pleasures without the weight of maternal oversight. He craved chariot races, performances on gilded stages, secret affairs with whomever caught his wandering eye luxuries, Agrippina dismissed as beneath the dignity of a Caesar. And yet, beyond Nero's desire for freedom, simmered a deeper fear. Because Agrippina was no ordinary mother. She was a political juggernaut who'd survived Caligula's madness and Claudius's suspicious demise. Worse still, Agrippina sensed her grip slipping and made the fatal miscalculation of openly hinting that perhaps Britannicus, the rightful son of Claudius, should have been emperor all along, a threat that Nero could neither forgive nor ignore. Thus began one of ancient Rome's most chilling chapters, a mother-son war that twisted love into a weapon sharper than any dagger, culminating in assassination plots so elaborate they could have sprung from the pages of a Hollywood thriller. Nero's first attempt to rid himself of Agrippina was a masterpiece of Roman engineering gone horribly wrong. He ordered the construction of a special boat designed to collapse and crush its passengers while out at sea, disguising murder as a tragic maritime accident. On the night of March 23rd, 59 AD, under skies heavy with stars, Agrippina stepped aboard the death ship, believing her son was honoring her with a gesture of reconciliation. But as the vessel drifted into deeper waters off Baiae, a hidden mechanism triggered, sending the cabin roof crashing down with a thunderous crack. Yet fate, or perhaps Agrippina's own ferocious will to live, intervened. For instead of killing the Empress Mother, the deadly contraption missed its mark, instantly crushing only her companion Asacritia. Amid the chaos, Agrippina, drenched and wounded, hurled herself into the moonlit waves, swimming for shore as Nero's henchmen thrashed the waters with oars and boat hooks, trying desperately to finish the job. It was a scene torn from the darkest Roman legends, a woman who had outlasted emperors, now clawing through black waves, robes dragging her downward, driven onward by sheer survival instinct. When word reached Nero that Agrippina had survived, panic consumed him, for he knew the empire's eyes were upon him and that his mother, alive and furious, could rally legions against him with a single whispered accusation. And so the emperor who sang poems as Rome burned ordered a simpler, bloodier solution: direct murder. He dispatched Anicetus, admiral of the fleet and the architect of the failed boat trap, to finish what the sea could not. In the dead of night, soldiers burst into Agrippina's villa, where she lay still, dripping from the sea, attempting to send desperate messages to her allies, but even cornered. Agrippina faced her death as she had faced life, unyielding. She rose from her bed, eyes blazing, and commanded her assassins with chilling final words, "Strike my womb first, for it bore such a monster." For a moment, even the hardened killers hesitated, confronted not with a helpless woman but with the unbreakable daughter of Germanicus and mother of an emperor. Yet duty or fear overcame hesitation, and their blades fell again and again, spilling imperial blood upon the marble floors. When Nero received word that Agrippina was finally dead, his first emotion wasn't grief, but relief. A chilling echo through the corridors of power that the last chain restraining his monstrous appetites had been severed. The Roman people, however, felt the tremors of matricide ripple through the empire, for in a world that worshipped family and the divine sanctity of motherhood, Nero's crime crossed a line from imperial cruelty into pure blasphemy. But for Nero, the path was clear with Agrippina gone. Nothing stood between him and the empire's total submission. And as we step into the next chapter, you'll witness how Rome's golden prince became the tyrant whose lust for power and pleasure would drown the city in blood, flames, and scandal. With Agrippina's lifeblood soaking the marble of her villa and her last defiant words still echoing through the empire, Rome braced for what would come next. For in the dark history of Rome, every drop of spilled imperial blood feeds the monster within, and Nero's monster was now unleashed without a single chain to restrain it. What followed was a reign of terror that cemented Nero's place among the worst Roman emperors, a descent so savage it still stands as a grim warning of how absolute power corrodes every boundary between man and beast. The death of his mother might have bought Nero freedom, but it also removed the last fragile barrier that held his darker instincts at bay. And like a dam bursting, the emperor poured his paranoia and sadism across the empire. At first, his hands turned toward anyone whose veins carried even a drop of imperial blood, as though the very idea of shared lineage threatened his fragile throne. The young emperor's appetite for blood was insatiable, and soon, Marcus Junius Silanus, a descendant of Augustus, found himself marked for elimination despite committing no crime beyond possessing a name that whispered of legitimacy. Silanus was poisoned, his life extinguished without trial, reminding Rome that in Nero's world, suspicion alone was a death sentence. Next fell Plautus, another member of the imperial family, executed on the flimsiest of pretexts, his noble blood soaking into the soil as a warning that no one, no matter how high-born, was safe under Rome's new master. But Nero's lust for blood refused to stop at the empire's fringes. It turned inward, devouring the very men who had once shaped him into the emperor he'd become. Sporus, the stoic Praetorian prefect who had guided Nero through his turbulent early years, succumbed under suspicious circumstances, officially throat cancer, though whispers in Rome's marble corridors spoke of poison mixed into honeyed wine. His death left a vacuum that Nero was all too eager to fill with sycophants and flatterers, men who would tell him that every whim was divine inspiration. And then came the final betrayal that stunned even those who thought they'd seen every shade of imperial treachery, the forced suicide of Seneca. The philosopher tutor who had once believed he could mold Nero into a wise and merciful ruler, summoned to face accusations he knew were fatal. Seneca chose the Roman way out, opening his veins in a steaming bath, dictating calm reflections on virtue even as his life spilled away in crimson rivulets, a grotesque juxtaposition of stoic philosophy and imperial murder that still haunts the dark annals of Roman history. These were not simply political executions, they were Nero's declaration of absolute sovereignty, an empire ruled not by laws or Senate decrees but by the whims of a single man whose soul had been twisted into something monstrous. Rome, meanwhile, held its breath as each day brought new rumors of disappearances, mysterious deaths, and confiscated estates, while citizens learned that to speak Nero's name even in private was to risk execution for treason. Yet amid this rising tide of fear, Nero found himself increasingly bored with mere bloodshed. He craved spectacles, pleasures, and distractions worthy of a man who saw himself not just as emperor, but as a divine artist, a god among mortals. And though he had murdered his mother and slaughtered his rivals, the heart of his empire still lay vulnerable, his marriage to Octavia, Claudius's quiet, virtuous daughter, a woman whose very existence reminded Rome of the golden age they'd lost. Octavia stood as the final link to the old order, a link Nero was determined to sever, especially as a new passion began to consume him. Poppaea Sabina, the glittering seductress whose ambitions would soon spark riots, executions, and a chain of events that would plunge Rome deeper into the abyss. And so, as we prepare to cross the threshold into the next chapter, remember this: the monster who wore the purple was only growing bolder, for Nero had discovered that killing not only secured his power, it thrilled him. And what he was about to do to Octavia would prove that Rome's worst emperor was only just getting started. After drowning Rome in the blood of his own family and advisors, Nero found himself consumed by a passion as lethal as any dagger, a flame that would incinerate what little remained of his public image and propel him further into the abyss of Rome's darkest scandals. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, a woman whose beauty glowed like gilded marble under torchlight and whose ambitions were sharper than any praetorian sword. In the dark history of Rome, Poppaea stands as the quintessential femme fatale, a figure draped in silk and secrets, who understood that in the imperial palace, seduction was the most powerful weapon of all, while Octavia, Nero's dutiful wife, moved quietly through the halls, embodying traditional Roman virtue. Poppaea shimmered like a living temptation, whispering poison into Nero's ears with each brush of her perfumed hair. It didn't matter that she was married to Marcus Salvius Otho, one of Nero's closest friends. Poppaea was a woman determined to become empress, even if Rome itself had to bleed to pave her path. Soon, Otho was conveniently shipped off to a distant governorship, clearing the stage for Nero and Poppaea's illicit affair, a relationship that would spark riots, murders, and a scandal so potent it still echoes through the corridors of history as one of the worst Roman emperor's most notorious crimes. Poppaea knew exactly how to fan Nero's growing resentment toward Octavia, whispering that as long as his first wife remained, he was nothing but a puppet to the Senate and the memory of Claudius. For Nero, Poppaea was everything Octavia was not: vibrant, sensual, daring, and entirely without moral constraint. Fueled by lust and paranoia, Nero tried first to rid himself of Octavia by divorce, inventing the claim that their marriage was invalid because of close familial ties, but Rome refused to accept such transparent lies. The people adored Octavia, seeing in her the last fragile link to a golden age, and when rumors spread that Nero intended to marry Poppaea, riots erupted across the city. Crowds stormed through Rome's streets, tearing down statues of Poppaea and crowning images of Octavia with flowers, chanting her name as though invoking a goddess to save the empire from descending into madness. For a fleeting moment, the emperor wavered, forced to recall that even absolute power was sometimes held in check by the roaring voice of the populace. Octavia was temporarily restored to the palace, while Poppaea was quietly shuffled off to a secluded villa. But Poppaea was not a woman who accepted defeat. She returned with even sharper claws, spinning tales of conspiracies and secret lovers, convincing Nero that Octavia was plotting against him. The accusations spiraled into an avalanche of forged confessions, forced from tortured slaves whose screams echoed through Rome's dungeons. Eventually, Nero declared Octavia guilty of adultery and treason, exiling her to the bleak island of Pandateria, the same place where her grandmother Julia had wasted away in imperial disgrace. But exile wasn't enough for Nero's increasingly paranoid mind. Within days, he ordered Octavia's execution. She was only 20 when soldiers arrived, binding her trembling hands and opening her veins so that her life drained away onto the cold stone of her prison cell. Even in death, Octavia clung to the memory of her murdered family, crying out the names of Claudius and Britannicus as the final warmth fled her body. Her severed head was dispatched to Rome as proof for Poppaea, who gazed upon the grisly trophy with satisfied triumph. 12 days later, Nero and Poppaea married in a ceremony so lavish it devoured the fortunes of entire provinces. The palace blazed with gold and gemstones, while Nero himself performed a special song he had composed for the occasion, as though the blood spilled to reach this moment could be drowned beneath waves of music and spectacle. Yet even amid this orchestrated paradise, darkness brewed. For Poppaea, the woman who had clawed her way to the pinnacle of imperial power, would soon discover that being loved by Nero was as deadly as being hated by him. And as we step forward, you'll witness how the same foot that once danced across Rome's gilded stages would become the weapon that shattered Poppaea's life, and how the worst Roman emperor turned his grief into a grotesque new obsession that would drag an innocent boy into one of history's most disturbing scandals. For a fleeting moment, after marrying Poppaea Sabina, Nero seemed to have secured both his empire and his personal passions, draping his life in silk, music, and theatrical triumphs. But in the dark history of Rome, love under the reign of the worst Roman emperor was never destined to survive, for the same man who had murdered his mother and stepbrother would soon spill the blood of the woman he claimed to adore. By 65 AD, Poppaea was again pregnant, carrying what Nero believed might finally be the male heir who would cement his dynasty and wash away the bloodstains of his crimes. Yet even in the glow of anticipated fatherhood, Nero's volcanic temper simmered just beneath the surface, ready to erupt at the slightest spark. Ancient sources vary on the precise moment Poppaea's fate was sealed, but the most damning account comes from Suetonius, who describes a violent argument erupting between the imperial couple, likely sparked by Poppaea daring to criticize Nero's endless obsession with chariot racing. Imagine the scene: Poppaea, heavily pregnant, standing her ground before a man who commanded armies, who held the power of life and death over millions, and who believed himself a divine artist whose every whim should be obeyed. Her defiance, even in private, was a spark thrown onto the emperor's powder-keg soul. In a flash of rage, Nero lashed out, driving his foot into Poppaea's swollen belly. An act of domestic violence so shocking it reverberates through history as one of Rome's darkest imperial scandals. Poppaea crumpled to the marble floor, blood pooling around her as her unborn child died inside her womb. Nero, staring down at his wife's lifeless body, showed no remorse, only irritation that the woman who had manipulated and maneuvered him into marriage dared to defy him. The emperor who had once proclaimed himself Rome's great artist, who wept over poetic tragedies on stage, felt nothing but contempt for the flesh and blood tragedy bleeding out before him. Slaves rushed forward to clean the mess, as if erasing the evidence could scrub away the emperor's monstrous guilt. But Nero's life would never be the same again. For in murdering Poppaea, he severed the final thread tethering him to any semblance of humanity. Yet the twisted depths of Nero's grief and his depravity were only just beginning to reveal themselves. Unable to live without the woman who had become both his partner in power and the mirror of his ambitions, Nero scoured his palace for a replacement, and in the flickering torchlight of the imperial corridors, his gaze fell upon a boy named Sporus, perhaps 13 or 14 years old, a slave whose delicate features and golden hair reminded Nero of Poppaea in her prime, in a move so vile that even the jaded senators of Rome could scarcely comprehend it. Nero ordered that Sporus be brought to him privately, and there, in secret chambers where imperial secrets were born and buried, the emperor pronounced a monstrous decree. The boy would be castrated, transformed into the physical likeness of the woman Nero had murdered. Physicians who had sworn oaths to heal were forced to hold Sporus down as heated blades carved away his manhood, while Nero looked on with predatory satisfaction. But mutilation was only the beginning of Sporus's living nightmare. As the boy's body struggled to heal, he was dressed in the robes of an empress, his hair curled and perfumed, his face painted to mimic the feminine allure that had once captivated Rome. Tutors were brought in to teach him how to walk, speak, and gesture like a woman, transforming Sporus into Nero's grotesque living memorial to Poppaea. And then, in an act that defies belief, even among Rome's catalog of imperial perversions, Nero announced his intention to marry Sporus in a full imperial ceremony, draped in bridal veils, adorned with jewels. Sporus was paraded before Rome as Nero's new empress, a spectacle that stunned even the most decadent of Rome's aristocracy into horrified silence. Guests were forced to attend the wedding feast, where Nero accepted wedding gifts and performed poetic recitals as if nothing about this grotesque charade was out of place. And so, amid gold and silk, the empire bore witness to the ultimate testament of Nero's madness, a man who could not resurrect his murdered wife, so he tried to recreate her in flesh and blood. Yet even as Nero lost himself in this theatrical farce, the empire was beginning to fracture under the weight of his extravagance and cruelty. For the man who forced a boy to become his bride would soon turn his hunger for spectacle upon Rome itself, dragging senators, nobles, and commoners into humiliations and horrors that made even this scandal look tame. And as we move forward, you'll see how the worst Roman emperor escalated his tyranny, transforming not only one boy's body but the entire city of Rome into his personal stage for blood, fear, and depraved entertainment. As the years of Nero's reign stretched onward like a crimson-stained scroll, Rome found itself held hostage by an emperor whose monstrous appetite for spectacle and humiliation grew more insatiable with every passing day. For in the dark history of Rome, there are few chapters as grotesque or terrifying as the one in which the worst Roman emperor transformed the imperial court into a stage for degradation and fear. The man who had murdered his own mother, his wives, and his rivals was no longer content with private atrocities. Now he demanded an audience, craving gasps, applause, and trembling submission from every corner of his empire. Nero, who once whispered verses as Rome burned, began to see cruelty itself as a form of entertainment, believing that art shone brightest when drenched in genuine human suffering. It was during these feverish years that the emperor, who styled himself as an artist, took a perverse delight in blurring the boundaries between noble blood and common filth, dragging Rome's most distinguished senators and equestrians from the marble corridors of power and thrusting them into the brutal world of the arena. Under Nero's orders, men who had once governed provinces and commanded legions found themselves stripped of their purple-trimmed togas and forced to fight as gladiators for the jeering masses, a spectacle so scandalous that the dark history of Rome can barely capture the humiliation these aristocrats endured. Imagine the horror of noblemen trained in rhetoric and diplomacy, now stumbling across the sand of the Colosseum, swords trembling in their soft hands, as Nero cackled from his imperial box. The blood that stained the arena floors was not just that of criminals or prisoners of war, but of Rome's political elite, reduced to meat for Nero's insatiable hunger for novelty and dominance. Yet the emperor's depravity was not satisfied by blood alone. He demanded performances of an even darker kind, forcing senators, knights, and noblewomen to appear on stage as actors, dancers, and even prostitutes in elaborate public shows. In a society where appearing on stage was considered lower than manual labor, these forced performances shattered the delicate social hierarchy upon which Rome's power was built, sowing fear that no one, no matter how exalted their rank, was safe from imperial whim. And Nero himself, the emperor who believed his voice a gift from the gods, insisted on performing alongside his victims, singing tragic arias while naked slaves were tortured to death beside him, or plucking his lyre while condemned prisoners were torn apart by wild animals. The empire watched in horrified silence as the ruler who was supposed to guard Rome's dignity instead turned it into his private circus of humiliation and gore, a theater where every scream and drop of blood was part of the performance. Even Rome's nighttime streets were not safe, for Nero, disguised in common clothing, would roam the city with a gang of equally depraved companions, attacking random citizens for sport, beating shopkeepers, assaulting women, and robbing travelers under the veil of darkness. Those who dared to fight back often found themselves charged with treason the following day, accused of assaulting the emperor himself, an accusation punishable by torture and death. And if that was not enough, Nero's infamous dinner parties descended into depravity that defied comprehension, feasts that lasted from sunset to dawn, drowning guests in oceans of wine while forcing them to witness live torture, sexual violence, and sometimes executions performed as entertainment. Here, amid golden goblets and perfumed air, Rome's elite sat trapped, terrified to leave, for fear that the emperor's displeasure might single them out as the next victim in his theater of cruelty. But even as Nero reached new heights of sadistic performance, the murmurs of rebellion began to echo from the empire's farthest provinces. For no matter how many songs Nero sang or how many gladiators fell, the weight of his tyranny and the emptiness of the imperial treasury were sowing seeds of revolt. And as we step forward into the next chapter, you'll see how Nero, believing himself the greatest artist and performer Rome had ever known, decided that his talents demanded an even grander stage, a stage that would lead him to Greece, to scandalous competitions, and ultimately to the unraveling of the emperor who mistook cruelty for art and believed an empire existed for his applause. As Nero's reign spiraled further into spectacle and depravity, the emperor who had once forced nobles into gladiatorial combat and transformed murder into theater, convinced himself that the only stage worthy of his talents lay beyond Rome's walls, across the glittering Aegean, in the land where art, music, and ancient myth intertwined Greece, cradle of civilization, and soon to be the backdrop for one of the worst Roman emperor's most bizarre and costly obsessions. For in the dark history of Rome, no emperor ever conflated political power with artistic vanity as dangerously as Nero, who believed that his destiny was not merely to rule, but to be adored as the greatest performer the world had ever seen. And so, in 66 AD, leaving behind a city choking on rumors and resentment, Nero launched his grand artistic tour, a journey that would drain Rome's treasury, humiliate the empire's dignity, and sow the seeds of his own destruction. From the moment his gilded fleet arrived on Greek shores, Nero threw himself into every festival and contest the Hellenic world could offer, determined to collect not military victories but laurel wreaths of artistic triumph. Singing, reciting poetry, strumming his lyre with trembling theatrical fervor, he competed in hundreds of contests, demanding that judges declare him victorious regardless of merit, a demand that turned even the sacred Olympic Games into a farce. In one notorious incident at the Olympics, Nero entered the four-horse chariot race, only to be thrown from his chariot mid-course. Yet, despite failing even to finish the race, the judges, terrified of imperial wrath, awarded him the victory anyway, praising his noble intentions as though that alone deserved the crown. By the time his tour ended, Nero had amassed over 1,800 first-place prizes, a haul so absurd it became a dark joke whispered from Athens to Rome. But while Nero reveled in applause purchased at the point of a sword, his empire was falling apart. The provinces bled under new taxes imposed to fund his artistic extravaganza. The legions grew restless, and the Praetorian Guard whispered in smoky taverns about the emperor who played the lyre while the empire burned. Governors in distant provinces, once eager to flatter Nero, began to question whether Rome could survive the chaos at its core. Among them was Gaius Julius Vindex in Gaul, who raised the banner of rebellion, declaring that the empire needed a ruler, not a performer, a sentiment that found echoing sympathy across the empire. Meanwhile, in Spain, Galba began marshalling forces, and even in Africa, normally the empire's granary of peace, tremors of unrest began to shake the pillars of Nero's authority. Yet Nero, blinded by his own delusions of grandeur, refused to see the tidal wave approaching. Instead, he returned to Rome triumphant, parading through the streets in the same chariot Augustus had used for conquering enemies. Though Nero's conquests were measured not in captured lands, but in singing competitions, draped in purple robes heavy with gold embroidery, he basked in the adulation of carefully staged crowds, believing himself not merely emperor, but a living god of art and performance. But the people, their patience threadbare, could no longer ignore the empty granaries, the rising taxes, and the sickening reality that Rome's supreme ruler cared more for theatrical applause than the empire's survival. And even Nero's beloved Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty had once seemed unbreakable, began to turn cold and calculating, weighing whether their futures lay with a mad artist or with the generals marching ever closer to the city's gates. And so, as we step into the final act of this imperial tragedy, remember, this Nero returned from Greece convinced that the world loved him, certain that he would be celebrated forever as Rome's great artist. Yet even as he rehearsed his next performance, the Senate sharpened its daggers, the legions chose new leaders, and fate prepared to close the curtain on the man who mistook applause for loyalty and who would soon discover that history always claims the final ovation. For waiting just beyond this delusion was the ultimate reckoning, a frantic flight through the Roman night, a crumbling villa, and the pathetic final moments of the emperor who believed himself a god, but died sobbing like a child. And so, the final curtain began to fall on the emperor who believed himself the world's greatest artist, as Rome seethed with rebellion, and the legions that once hailed Nero as Caesar now marched under new banners. For in the dark history of Rome, no tyrant, however monstrous, could rule forever. And the worst Roman emperor was about to discover that applause cannot drown out the roar of history's vengeance. By June 68th, A.D., Nero awoke in a palace stripped of loyalty. The marble halls, once echoing with sycophantic flattery, now ominously silent. The Senate had declared him a public enemy, sentencing him not merely to death, but to a punishment reserved for the lowest criminals being flogged naked until death. His body cast into the Tiber like refuse. The Praetorian Guard, once his personal wall of steel, melted away under the weight of bribes and shifting allegiances, leaving the emperor who had commanded legions and staged tortures for entertainment utterly alone. Even the palace slaves began to vanish into Rome's labyrinthine streets, unwilling to risk dying alongside the man who had become the symbol of imperial madness. In this desperate hour, Nero, the emperor who had forced nobles to fight like gladiators and who once gazed serenely upon a burning Rome, transformed into a terrified fugitive, stumbling through darkened corridors, sobbing and shrieking that the world had misunderstood his artistry. Clutching at the few loyal followers he had left, his freedman Phaon, his secretary Epaphroditus, his valet Neophytus, and Sporus, the boy he had mutilated and married Nero, slipped out of the palace under the cover of night. A grotesque parody of imperial dignity cloaked in a humble servant's cloak. They crept through olive groves and moonlit fields toward Phaon's suburban villa, Nero's golden sandals sinking into dirt and dew, as the emperor who once rode in jeweled chariots now stumbled like a common thief. Upon arrival, Nero's terror reached new heights. He dared not enter through the front gate for fear of betrayal, forcing his companions to dig a tunnel beneath the villa's walls, crawling on his hands and knees through dust and darkness. Nero emerged into a cramped cellar where the ruler of the world now cowered, trembling amid cracked plaster and cheap wooden beams. As dawn's pale light seeped through the small window, news trickled in like poison. Galba was proclaimed emperor. The Praetorians hunted Nero to claim his head as a trophy, and the Senate's condemnation grew louder with each passing moment. The final blow to Nero's fragile psyche arrived when a messenger breathlessly reported that his own servants were looting the imperial palace, hauling away golden statues, silken drapes, and even the emperor's costumes and instruments. "They're stealing my things." Nero wailed, his voice cracking like a lyre string, weeping not for his empire or his crimes, but for the loss of his glittering possessions. In that single pitiful cry, the man who forced millions to worship his image revealed his truest self, a child in a costume, utterly unprepared to face the consequences of his monstrous reign. And yet, the worst was still to come. As hoofbeats approached, echoing over Rome's hills, Nero's companions urged him to act. Epaphroditus, his secretary, reminded him of the fates of other defeated tyrants, of molten gold poured down throats and flesh flayed from bone, the man who had ordered countless executions, who once forced nobles to kneel before him, now quaked at the thought of being paraded through Rome, naked and bleeding, while the citizens he once terrorized spat curses and stones. At last, facing the inevitable, Nero picked up a dagger, hands shaking violently, tears streaming down his painted cheeks. He whimpered that he could not drive the blade himself, protesting that his hands were made for creating beauty, not violence. Even in this moment of ultimate judgment, Nero could not comprehend that ordering murders was the same as wielding the knife. It fell to Epaphroditus to finish what the emperor could not. As soldiers closed in, Nero pressed the dagger clumsily to his throat, unable to strike the final blow. Epaphroditus leaned forward, gripping the emperor's trembling hand, and drove the blade home. Blood blossomed from Nero's neck as he fell to the dirt floor, gasping through gurgled breaths the final words that history would immortalize. Qualis artifex pareo. What an artist dies in me. And so ended the life of Rome's most notorious monster, not amid triumph or the thunder of applause, but in a dusty cellar, sobbing and choking on his own blood, abandoned by all, save the ghostly echoes of his own crimes. But even as Nero's eyes glazed over, the empire itself was changing, for waiting beyond his death was a new chaos, a year of 4 emperors, and a desperate struggle to erase the memory of a man whose reign had plunged Rome into darkness. And as we move forward, one question remains. Can history ever truly forget a monster who believed that cruelty was art, and who left behind a cautionary tale still echoing through time? when Nero's final gasp faded into silence and the dust of that humble villa swallowed his corpse. Rome exhaled a collective sigh it had held for 14 years, for in the dark history of Rome, the death of the worst Roman emperor was not a tragedy but a liberation, a rupture in time when a nightmare ended and the empire could dare to dream of healing. Yet the shadows Nero cast were far too long to vanish with a single dagger thrust, and the empire awoke to the chaos of the year of the 4 emperors, a maelstrom of civil war, assassinations, and shifting allegiances that revealed how deeply his reign had corroded the foundations of Roman power. The Senate, desperate to purge the memory of Nero's monstrous rule, passed the ultimate sentence of damnatio memoriae, chiseling his name from monuments, melting his statues into coins, and erasing his face from the marble record. But history is never so easily scrubbed clean. The Romans tried to pretend he had never existed, but his crimes were too vivid, his scandals too grotesque, and his downfall too poetic for the world to forget. The golden house he built atop Rome's ashes was buried under concrete and public baths, its shimmering corridors suffocated beneath layers of imperial shame. And yet, even as Rome tried to erase him, the legend of Nero grew more monstrous in the telling. Ancient historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, each writing with barely concealed disgust, cataloged his crimes in detail so graphic they seemed torn from nightmares: the emperor who kicked his pregnant wife to death, who castrated a boy to play empress, who sang while Rome burned, and who turned torture into performance art. They painted him not merely as a tyrant, but as a cautionary tale, a man who began as a promising young ruler and descended into a vortex of paranoia, vanity, and cruelty. The worst Roman emperor became the ultimate warning that absolute power, once corrupted, can twist even an artist's soul into something monstrous. And across centuries, Nero's story has remained hauntingly relevant, for his reign stands as a stark reminder that beneath the marble glories of civilization, there always lurks the fragile human psyche, capable of unspeakable darkness when left unchecked. His narcissism blinded him to the truth that terror is a brittle foundation for loyalty, and that a ruler who forces an empire to kneel will find himself alone when the tides turn. From the moment he ordered Britannicus poisoned at a dinner table to the instant he whimpered for help to end his own life, Nero's reign was a performance, each act bloodier and more extravagant than the last, revealing a man who confused cruelty with artistry, applause with love, and domination with immortality. His final words: "What an artist dies in me," were not merely the lament of a man who fancied himself a poet, but the perfect epitaph for a tyrant who mistook his crimes for grand theater. Even today, historians and filmmakers alike remain obsessed with Nero's legacy, spinning countless documentaries, dramas, and viral videos dissecting how one emperor could embody both Rome's pinnacle of splendor and its darkest abyss. Search any platform for Nero's death, worst Roman emperors or craziest rulers in history, and his name rises like smoke from a burning city, refusing to be forgotten. And perhaps that is Nero's final triumph and ultimate curse. For while Rome buried his palace and tried to erase his name, his story endures, echoing as a chilling whisper through time, reminding us that the monsters of history were once men, and that power without conscience leads inevitably to ruin. And as we step away from the blood-soaked stage of Nero's life, remember history is not merely dates and names, but the pulse of human choices, dark and bright. And it's up to us to learn from both. If you've made it this far, I'd love to know your thoughts. Do you see Nero as an outlier of madness, or a mirror reflecting the dangers that lurk in all unchecked power? Drop your comments below. Hit like if this story gripped you, and subscribe for more dives into the hidden, sometimes horrifying truths of history. Because as Nero's life proves beyond doubt, Sometimes the past is more shocking and more viral than any fiction we could invent. And so, as the final echoes of Nero's death fade into the cavernous silence of history, we stand gazing back at a story so drenched in blood, ambition, and madness that it reads less like a chronicle of ancient Rome and more like a cautionary epic carved into the very bones of human civilization. For in the dark history of Rome, few figures burn as brightly and as terrifyingly as Nero, the emperor whose name remains synonymous with tyranny and excess. His life was a twisted theater where cruelty wore the mask of artistry, where poetry and poison shared the same stage, and where absolute power devoured everything, even his own soul. From the moment he entered this world under omens of fire to the night he crawled through the dirt of a freedman's villa, sobbing that "what an artist dies in me," Nero embodied the truth that monsters are not born, but made sculpted by unchecked authority, flattery, and a court too fearful to say no. And though his golden house has been buried beneath baths and amphitheaters, and his statues shattered into dust, the memory of Nero refuses to die. Search the web today for worst Roman emperor, craziest tyrants in history, or dark secrets of Rome, and his face will glare back at you from 1,000 thumbnails, eyes blazing with the same manic fervor that once lit the flames consuming his city. He is a star in history's viral pantheon because his story taps into something primal within us, all fascination with the thin line between genius and insanity, between a ruler and a tyrant, between civilization and chaos. Even modern filmmakers and historians cannot resist returning to the scene of his crimes, compelled to reimagine the man who believed he could shape reality through performance while drowning his empire in fear. Nero's life is a lesson that power without limits transforms men into monsters, and that beneath the purple robes and marble halls, an emperor's heart can harbor darkness darker than any night Rome ever witnessed. But his story is also a mirror held up to every era, including our own, reminding us how swiftly the tides can turn when leaders mistake personal glory for the good of the people. As we close this chapter on Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, remember that history is not simply an archive of dates and dust, but a living pulse beating beneath our modern world. The shadows of men like Nero linger in boardrooms, political halls, and digital empires, and the lessons carved from Rome's tragedies echo in headlines even today. And as creators, historians, and seekers of hidden truths, we dig into these ancient horrors not merely to gawk at their grotesquerie, but to shine a light into the dark corners of human nature, hoping that by remembering, we might avoid repeating. If this story of Rome's most notorious emperor gripped you, if you felt your pulse quicken as we crawled through Nero's rise and catastrophic fall, let me know in the comments what shocked you most. Was it his savage murder of his own mother, his gruesome wedding to Sporus, or the haunting final words that revealed a man utterly consumed by his own myth? Drop your thoughts below, because I'm genuinely curious to see what moments hit hardest for you. And if you crave more journeys into the dark corridors of human history, stories of emperors, tyrants, forbidden scandals, and forgotten truths, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, because here, we don't just tell history, we bring it roaring back to life, raw, unfiltered, and sometimes more horrifying than any horror film could invent. And stay tuned, because in our next dive into the secrets of the ancient world, we'll uncover another true tale where power, passion, and cruelty collide, proving once again that in the saga of humanity, the past is never truly past. It's always waiting, like an unquiet ghost, to remind us of the darkness that lurks just beneath the surface. And now, as the smoke clears over the scorched ruins of Nero's empire and the echoes of his final gasp fade into the marble labyrinth of Roman memory, we stand at the threshold of a question that stretches far beyond the blood-soaked corridors of the Palatine Hill. What do we modern watchers of history's grim theater truly take from the tale of the worst Roman emperor, whose name still burns like an unextinguished ember in the annals of the dark history of Rome, because Nero was not merely a tyrant, nor simply an artist lost in his own delusions. He was a brutal revelation about human nature, the ultimate proof that when power knows no limits, even the most glittering talents become instruments of terror. From the first screams of Britannicus convulsing on the palace floor to the blood pooling beneath Poppeia's broken body, from the flaming Christians lighting Nero's gardens to the trembling senators forced to become gladiators in his sadistic circus, every act of Nero's life was a punchline in a monstrous joke only he seemed to find amusing, a joke that cost tens of thousands of lives and scarred the soul of an empire. And yet, if we look closer, his story is more than just horror. It's a mirror, reflecting the same hungers that pulse beneath the skin of every civilization. Fame, control, the belief that we are unique, destined for immortality. In a world of social media influencers, celebrity scandals, and leaders obsessed with crafting their own narratives, Nero's life feels eerily modern. Search Nero legacy, worst emperors ever, or craziest rulers in history on YouTube today, and you'll find his twisted grin staring back at you from countless viral thumbnails. He's become a meme and a warning, simultaneously a testament to the fact that while technology changes, the human heart rarely does. His name trends because he embodies the perfect storm of violence, charisma, spectacle, and tragedy that modern audiences crave. But here's the brutal truth. History doesn't end with Nero. The empire that staggered under his madness didn't fall overnight. It survived, bruised and bloodied, lurching forward into new eras of intrigue, betrayal, and unspeakable secrets waiting to be unearthed. And that's why our journey doesn't stop here. Because lurking in the shadows of the Roman Forum are other names: Caligula, whose depravity turned Rome into a blood-soaked stage; Commodus, who fancied himself a god-king gladiator; Caracalla, who slaughtered an entire city on a whim. Beyond Rome lie pharaohs drowned in incest and paranoia, medieval kings who feasted while peasants starved, sultans and khans whose whims reshaped continents. These are not just names in dusty scrolls. They are the fuel for viral stories that both fascinate and horrify. Living proof that the darkness Nero embodied is not confined to ancient marble halls, but flickers eternally wherever humans wield power without conscience. So if you've traveled this entire bloody road with me, I want you to remember Nero's story is not just Rome's past. It's a warning for every future. And if you're hungry for more hidden corners of human history, if you crave the true tales more shocking than any fiction, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. Because in our next deep dive, we're ripping open the veil on a ruler whose crimes might even eclipse Nero's, a monarch so twisted that his own court whispered his name in fear. A story drenched in lust, betrayal, and the ultimate price of power. Trust me, you won't want to miss the dark secrets we're about to unveil. Because here, in this corner of YouTube, we don't just tell stories. We drag the ghosts of history into the light, raw, real, and unforgettable. And the shadows we're about to explore next might just change how you see everything you thought you knew about power and the monsters who wear its crown. And so, as we step back from the blood-slick marble floors of Nero's reign, as the echoes of his final, pitiful cries fade beneath the weight of centuries, we find ourselves standing on the threshold of a deeper question. How does a single man plunge the mightiest empire in history into chaos, and yet leave behind a name so powerful that it still ignites viral flames across the modern world? For in the dark history of Rome, and in the tapestry of tyrants throughout time, few names burn with such radioactive infamy as Nero, the worst Roman emperor whose very existence remains a paradox of human fascination. His story is the ultimate collision of art and atrocity, of velvet drapes soaked in blood, of music composed over the screams of dying men. Search Nero Downfall, Worst Emperors Ever, or Dark Secrets of History on YouTube, and there he is, gazing back with wild eyes from thumbnails designed to seduce your click, because we cannot look away from monsters who wear crowns. Yet, the reason we keep returning to Nero's tale, in books, documentaries, podcasts, and viral videos, is not merely morbid curiosity. It's because he shows us something deeply human and terrifying, that absolute power does not simply corrupt. It devours the soul until the man who once dreamed of mercy ends up castrating boys to replace murdered wives and weeping over stolen costumes as an empire burns around him. And in that revelation, we glimpse a truth that transcends time, that the darkness Nero embodied is not ancient history, but a warning still beating in the veins of our modern world. Because power, unchecked and worshipped, will always produce new Neros, whether in gilded palaces, political chambers, or digital empires ruled by likes, views, and algorithmic applause. And that, my friends, is why our journey doesn't end here. For lurking just beyond the smoldering ruins of Nero's golden house are other shadows waiting to be dragged into the light stories of emperors who declared themselves gods, kings who murdered siblings to hold a throne, queens who turned seduction into statecraft, and conquerors whose ambition devoured continents. In the next episode, we'll dive into one such ruler whose very name sent chills through the corridors of Rome, a man whose cruelty might eclipse even Nero's, whose paranoia unleashed purges so savage they reshaped the empire's destiny, and whose death triggered a crisis that nearly shattered the Roman world forever. Trust me, you do not want to miss the dark truths we're about to uncover, so if Nero's tale twisted your gut, made your pulse race, or left you staring at the screen in horrified wonder, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what we're digging up next will make even Nero's blood-soaked reign look like a prelude. And let me know in the comments, who do you think was worse than Nero Caligula, Commodus Caracalla, or perhaps someone you've never even heard of, whose crimes have been buried beneath centuries of silence? I want to hear your guesses, because the shadows of history are vast, and together, we're going to rip the curtain wide open. This is not just storytelling, it's time travel into humanity's darkest corners. And I promise, the next name we speak will leave you questioning just how thin the line really is between ruler and monster. Stay tuned, because in our next viral history dive, we'll prove once again that the past is never dead. It's waiting, watching, and sometimes it sings in the voice of a mad emperor as Rome burns beneath his stage. And now, as the dust settles over the ruinous spectacle of Nero's life, and the final echoes of his gurgled death cry fade into the silence of history, we're left staring into the abyss of a question that has haunted every empire, every throne, and every generation of humankind. How does a man who began as Rome's golden boy become the worst Roman emperor? A figure so monstrous that his name still ignites viral fires across YouTube searches for Nero's madness, worst tyrants in history, and dark secrets of Rome. Because if there's one truth the story of Nero shoves into our faces like a blade, it's that evil does not always appear as a beast roaring from the shadows. Sometimes it comes draped in velvet, reciting poetry, weeping crocodile tears while cities burn in its name. From the moment he inherited the empire at 17, Nero promised Rome an age of mercy and peace, speaking with a voice so soft it lulled senators into complacency. But lurking beneath that honeyed tone was the soul of an artist who would one day turn human suffering into his private stage. It's why we remember him not merely as a tyrant but as a twisted performer, composing lyrics as flames devoured his city, orchestrating murders like stage plays, and forcing a terrified boy named Sporus to become his empress in a grotesque parody of love. and it's why his face still glowers from viral video thumbnails, beckoning modern viewers with the same wicked curiosity that drew crowds to the blood-soaked sands of the Colosseum. Because the real horror of Nero's legacy is that it speaks to something timeless, the human hunger for spectacle, the way crowds can cheer a monster if he sings beautifully enough, and the way power corrupts even the brightest promise until all that remains is blood and ashes. Yet Rome did not crumble the day Nero fell. It stumbled on, bruised and battered, through civil war and new emperors vying for a throne still haunted by his ghost. And so we're left with this question that should keep us all awake at night: is Nero merely an ancient aberration or a warning that the same darkness could return, clothed in new technology, new charisma, and new excuses for cruelty? Because the same forces that created Nero still exist in boardrooms, political halls, and the digital echo chambers where today's influencers craft their own cults of personality. And that's why, my friends, our journey cannot end here. For lurking in the shadows of the Palatine Hill and echoing through the marble corridors of forgotten palaces are other names, other tyrants, other stories so shocking they've barely been whispered, let alone shouted from the rooftops of viral content. In the next video, we'll pull back the curtain on one such ruler whose legend might even eclipse Nero's, a man whose cruelty turned Rome into a slaughterhouse, whose paranoia knew no bounds, and whose death sent shockwaves through an empire already trembling under the weight of too much blood. Trust me, you do not want to miss the brutal truths we're about to unleash. So if the tale of Nero, the boy emperor who became a monster, left your heart racing and your mind reeling, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell, because our next dive will plunge you even deeper into history's darkest corridors. And tell me in the comments below, who do you think wore the crown of cruelty even more grotesquely than Nero? Was it Caligula, the emperor who wanted to make his horse a consul commodus, who slaughtered Rome's nobility for sport? Or is there another name lurking in history's shadows, waiting to explode into viral infamy? I'm dying to know your guesses, because together, we're going to drag every hidden monster into the spotlight. This isn't just history, it's the raw pulse of humanity's darkest instincts. And here on this channel, we're not afraid to face it head-on. Stay tuned, because the next story might just be the one that makes you question whether the monsters of the past ever truly died, or whether they're still waiting, whispering to anyone who dares to listen. And as we stand together on the smoking threshold between history and memory, gazing back at the monster who was once Rome's golden boy, the question that claws at the edges of every mind brave enough to look into Nero's abyss is chillingly simple. How does a man so young, so adored, so full of promise become the worst Roman emperor, a figure whose name still blazes across viral thumbnails whenever people search Nero's cruelty, history's worst rulers, or dark secrets of Rome? Because Nero's story is not merely a tragedy written in the blood of the innocent, it's a grim mirror held up to the human soul, revealing how fragile our morality truly is when touched by absolute power. From the shining corridors of the Palatine Palace to the dim cellars where he died, choking on his own blood, Nero's life unfolded like a brutal performance, each act more grotesque than the last, reminding us that evil does not arrive in monstrous form, but slips in wearing a crown, carrying a lyre, whispering poetry while sharpening a dagger behind its back. The emperor who wept for his own artistry as Rome burned was the same man who forced a young boy to become his wife, who engineered collapsing boats to kill his own mother, and who transformed torture into public spectacle under the golden ceilings of his monstrous palace. It's why we still whisper his name 2,000 years later. Why historians and content creators alike keep resurrecting him in documentaries, podcasts, and viral videos. Because Nero stands as the perfect storm of all the things that both horrify and captivate us: charisma, artistry, megalomania, and a savage willingness to spill blood to protect a fragile ego. And while Rome tried to erase him with damnatio memoriae, chiseling his face from statues and grinding his name from inscriptions, they failed spectacularly. Because no matter how deep you bury a monster, the world will keep digging, driven by that irresistible human need to understand how such horrors come to be. But if we look closer, the real reason Nero endures is because his story is not ancient, it's eternal. The same forces that shaped him still swirl around us today, hiding in politics, entertainment, social media influencers who build cults of personality, and leaders who crave applause more than truth. Search what makes a tyrant or worst rulers in history on YouTube, and Nero will be there, glaring at you from 1,000 thumbnails, daring you to look away. But we won't look away. Because here on this channel, we're committed to dragging history's shadows into the spotlight, exposing the hidden truths others would rather bury, and reminding the world that the monsters of the past never truly vanish. They merely wait for new masks to wear. And that's why our journey is only beginning. Because next time, we'll dive into another true story so shocking, so dripping with scandal, that it might make even Nero's horrors look tame. A ruler whose name was whispered in terror, whose cruelty reshaped empires, and whose downfall sent shockwaves across continents. So if the story of Nero, the artist who became a monster, has left your mind spinning and your heart pounding, hit that like button, subscribe, and join me for our next dive into the dark corridors of human history. And tell me in the comments below, do you believe monsters like Nero are born or made? I want to hear your thoughts, because your voice matters here. Together, we're not just recounting history, we're shining a light into its darkest corners. And the ghosts we're about to summon next will prove that truth is always stranger and far more horrifying than fiction. And so, as we leave behind the blood-soaked echoes of Nero's stage, one truth stands blazing like fire across centuries. Monsters like Nero remind us that evil doesn't arrive howling at the gates. It slips in quietly, disguised as beauty, talent, or a promise to save the world. And that is the chilling wisdom Nero leaves us, that the line between greatness and depravity is razor thin. And any of us, given power without limits, might become the very thing we fear. But remember, this history is not just the story of monsters, it's also the story of those who dared to watch, to question, and to speak out. And in an age where new Neros might rise not on marble thrones but in digital empires, your curiosity, your voice, your refusal to look away, that's the real safeguard against darkness. So if this journey into the worst Roman emperor's twisted soul made your pulse race or your mind spin, don't let it end here. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, do you believe Nero was born a monster or made into one by power and fear? Hit that like button so this truth can spread. Save this video so you can revisit the shadows, and subscribe right now, because the next tale I'm about to share will plunge us even deeper into the dark corridors of human history. The monsters are waiting. Let's go find them together.